Hi, everybody. I'm Joseph Smarr. I'm from Plaxo, and I'm going to help you guys navigate this landscape of all these different open social web building blocks and how they all fit together, which is something that I have a hard enough time keeping up with myself, and it's something I do every day. And so my hope is that this is something you'll all be able to at least learn a little bit more about what some of these names you've heard of mean and how they all fit together. Before I get started, the House has asked me to make a few announcements. We have rescheduled surprisingly rockin' JavaScript and DOM programming in GWT. It will now take place at 2 o'clock in room 9. And we will repeat the session, building a scalable web application with Google Apps Engine, at 12:45 in room 8. And all sessions, excluding the fireside chats, will be posted by mid-next week on the Google I/O website. And, of course, please remember to fill in your evaluation forms, unless you didn't like the talk. Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started. And I should say in advance, all of these slides are going to be up on my website, josephsmarr.com, and hopefully Google will also put stuff up as well. So the fact that you're here in the social track at I/O means presumably I don't have to convince you that social is a big deal for websites. There's so many websites that are finding that doing activities in a social way make them more compelling. Not just big social networks, but a whole spate of little sites that figured out that doing something with a bit of a social twist, whether it's travel or bookmarking or photos or whatever, makes it better. And it's hard for people to make sense of how is that landscape all going to shake out. And at the same time, there's this myriad of building blocks that us developers are all working on, some of which you may have heard of, some of which you may not have, that are helping solve bits of these pieces of how do we make these all play together in a more holistic way so that users aren't having to constantly do things from scratch and developers aren't having to constantly do things from scratch. How many of you have heard of at least some of these? And for how many of you is there at least one of them that you don't really understand but wish you understood better? Okay, that's kind of what I figured. So what I'm going to basically answer for you guys today is a sort of a simple but important question, I think, which is, how do all these pieces fit together? For each one of them, I'm not going to try to give you a deep technical understanding, although I'm happy to talk as deeply technically about any one of them as you want during the Q&A, and I'll try to leave some good room there. But I at least want you to know when you walk out of the room that sort of what OAuth conceptually is, what it does, how it fits into the bigger pieces, so that you can go back and kind of figure out how to learn more and start to strategize and learn about where stuff is being done, where you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And then sort of related, what does this all mean for the industry? I think it's very confusing to a lot of people in a world where people are opening up and there's bigger and smaller sites. How is this all going to play out, and where are the opportunities for everybody to do well, both as users and as businesses? So that's really going to be sort of the point of the talk. So I'm going to start by kind of going through a bunch of these building blocks individually and showing how I think they all fit together. And then I'm going to end by sort of painting what I think is a sort of comprehensive vision of how the social web is sort of evolving. And presumably, I also don't have to tell you guys, since you're in this room, how broken things are today. As exciting as we all are about the social web and how many people are using social websites, they're fundamentally just incredibly primitive and broken today, right? Every single site basically acts like you've never used another website before in your life, right? You show up to this website, and it's like, oh, create a username and password. Okay, I don't have 10 of those already, right? Oh, fill in all your profile information. I've never uploaded a profile photo before. You know, like, oh, find all your friends. Oh, ask them if they're really your friends. Oh, start sharing information, right? And this obviously does not scale. And it's gotten to the point now where, because there's so many great things that can be social, that pain, that fragmentation of not knowing who's using what tools, not seeing what your friends are doing, you know, having to redo a bunch of information over and over again, is really hurting mainstream adoption. And the way you see it manifested is not just people complaining about social network fatigue, it's all the people who aren't online or aren't using as many of these tools as they should be. That's really the way you can tell that things aren't as good as they should be. This is something that everybody wants to do. It's just too hard right now. And that's because the technology infrastructure, the architecture of the social web is still very nascent. It happens so fast, everybody just built it from scratch. And the simplest thing, of course, to do is to build your own silo, right? That obviously doesn't scale, and we've now hit the breaking point. And yet, if you want to be a developer now building a new social app, and you sort of say, okay, I want to do it right, what do I do? Well, until quite recently, you know, there hasn't really been a very palatable set of options. Because either you sort of say, well, yeah, I hate to, you know, fragment things even more, but what is my choice? I guess I got to build a database, I got to build a user registration system, you know. And so you're going to create yet another silo, and it's increasingly hard to get people to then come and join, let alone find their friends and have a rich social interaction. Or you sort of say, well, okay, there's some of these big social networks that have got these, you know, platforms that sort of live inside of them. So I guess I could go be a widget living inside of, you know, Facebook or MySpace or OpenSocial or whatever. But then I don't really have my own website with my own users and my own engagement. I'm kind of beholden to the data and the whims. And what if I want to have a bunch of users, use my site that don't use that particular platform. Like, that hasn't been a very satisfying answer for a large class of applications either. And so what do? Well, I think as developers, we think, well, let's build some technology that makes this work, and lots of people have been doing that. And when I showed you that spate of logos, though, these are all things that are an amazingly, harmonious coalescing around solving this problem, and yet they were all started for completely different reasons, different aspects of the itches that people were scratching. But the organizing theme, I think, that's going on that I will hopefully use as the sort of grounding of which each of these pieces fit is technology that helps you establish who I am as a user. Who am I? What sites do I use? What data do I have about me? What's my personal persona versus my professional persona? Stuff around who I know, right? Who are my friends? Who are my business colleagues? What are they? What's going on? And then, pulling the activity together, being able to say, well, what are the people? When I want to stay in touch with somebody, that no longer means just having their latest contact info. It means keeping track with this rich digital life that they're living in an increasingly fragmented social web. And so what I'm going to go through each of these technologies and sort of show you how I think they fit into these buckets: who I am, who I know, and what's going on, right? So let's start with who I am. And when I say who I am, what I mean is, how do you create a real durable online identity? That is, when I go to a site, it's, hey, that's Joseph, and that's the same Joseph I knew from before. That's not user number 12345 in this database, right? When you think about it, every time you go to a website and start with an account from scratch, even if I'm jsmar on Flickr and jsmar on Twitter, that's completely incidental, right? There's no link that actually tells you that's the same Joseph I already know and maybe already have some context with. And for me as a user, there's no way for me to tell the site, hey, I've actually already got all this rich online activity. Why not use that, right? And so it's very, very important, not only for reducing friction, but if you want to start building trust and reputation and rich sharing and all of that sort of history, that's how it works in the real world, right? As I go and meet more people and give more talks, I'm meeting more and more people, and I don't have to re-meet them every time I see them at a new conference, right? Those relationships persist, and that's an incredibly important part of the real world that's lacking on the social web right now. So obviously, OpenID is a big piece of that. OpenID is something that hopefully most of you at least heard of, and it's, I think, of all these technologies, one that's gone the furthest from being a grassroots project to something that's gotten mainstream adoption. Yahoo and AOL both provide OpenIDs for all of their users. Google accepts and produces OpenIDs for Blogger, and there's the foundation has got a bunch of other big people in it. And OpenID does something very, very simple. It lets you prove to one site that you are this URL, this user on some other site. So that could be I'm, jsmar on Twitter, or it could be I'm josephsmar.com. But it allows me to go to a site that I've never been to before and say, hey, I've already got a presence somewhere else. Let me show you. And by going in and logging in and trusting the site that I already use, I can go to the site, and I don't have to create a separate username and password on this new site because it can know me by one of my existing identities. And that then forms a bridge where I can start to share data. I can start to do a lot of other interesting things. But it's that fundamental building block that says, hey, I already use another site. Let me show you, and start to be able to attach that. And so let me show you what it looks like in case you haven't seen it. This is what happens when you sign up for Plaxo. We're a consumer of OpenIDs. And so while you can go to the normal registration page and sign up for a account from scratch, you can see on the left hand, you can just say, oh, sign in with a OpenID. Or because of Yahoo, they're using this extra user-friendly step of just saying, oh, just sign in with a Yahoo ID, right? Users know how to do that. They know, oh, I already use Yahoo. That's cool, right? And you go through, and you log into your OpenID provider, and it says, hey, do you trust anything.plaxo.com to know that you're really this user? This is, in this case, I'm using my OpenID. But there's a lot of different sites that support. And you can use, that's one of the important things about OpenID, is you can choose who you trust as your provider. And then it says, by the way, you've already filled in this profile information before. Is it okay if Plaxo has access to that? And I can say, sure. And then it bounces me back over to Plaxo, and voila. I've got my information. I don't have to create a separate password. It's already got an account for me based on that OpenID. And when I go through the registration process, all that information is already pre-filled, right? So that's really good for me as a user. It's also good for Plaxo because it means we can get people in the door faster, get more contact information, and start to have a more lasting relationship. So that's OpenID. Another really important piece that's actually much simpler but very powerful and works very well in concert with OpenID is to be able to say, here are some of the other websites that I'm already using. And rather than having to make all websites that I ever use OpenID providers, you can also just say, well, let me hyperlink to some of the other sites that I use. And rather than just being a normal hyperlink, you just add this very small little bit of HTML where you say ahref equals URL, rel equals me. And that's a simple little microformat that tells computers when they come and look at that page, that's another profile page about me. That's part of my aggregated online identity. And so what you can do is then when you start to come and say, here's one URL that I know you by, maybe it's your OpenID or maybe it's you hooked up, here's my Twitter account or whatever, you can start to follow those me links and then follow the other me links beyond that and sort of pull together this more composite view of the sites that I use. And what's really cool is Google then, because Google already crawls all the public web where you put these links, they've made it a sort of a cached version available via the Social Graph API where you can basically query on any URL or any set of URLs, and they'll follow all the me links for you and give you back the sort of full canonicalized list of stuff you have. So whenever a user comes to your site and you want to say, I don't want to start over from scratch, tell me what you already do. Tell me if you already have photos. Tell me if you already have bookmarks. You can just follow these me links using the Social Graph API, and you can very easily do that. So to give you an illustration of what that looks like, say I come to a page and I just tell you about my homepage, josephsmarr.com. Right now, you don't really know that much about me. But if you follow those me links out, you'll see that I actually have a lot of different sites that I use. And so some of those sites I link to directly off of my homepage, and then some of those sites link to other sites. So say I link to my Plaxo page, and it links to my Yelp and Upcoming, Jaiku, and Pounce page. And Pounce also lets you link out to other sites you use, so they link to even some more sites. And a lot of those sites link back up to my josephsmarr.com page. So in fact, we see the solid versus dashed lines. The solid lines are actually ones where there's a bidirectional link or a cycle where you can actually say, for example, if I logged in with my josephsmarr.com, well, he wouldn't be able to add those me links to that page if he didn't control that page. So I can assume that he owns the ones downstream. But then those ones point back to Joseph Smarr. So it really is, I can tell it's really the same person, right? Like I could link out to Bill Gates' homepage with a rel equals me, but he's not going to link back to me the same way. So you can actually use the link structure of the web to gain some trust that this really is the same person you're talking to. And you can see this is going to come in very handy, not only for me to not start over from scratch with my own profile and to be able to mash up different content, and do something richer, but when my friends from these other services try to come find me on this new site, if you say, oh, well, you're already friends on Pounce or you're already friends on Upcoming, you actually do know this person on this site. That starts to become a very powerful way of linking users together. And so you take that and you put it together with something like Google's Social Graph API, and we do this on Plaxo. So if you come to Plaxo and you sign up, we can auto-suggest a whole bunch of sites that you might want to share in Pulse. So if you haven't seen Plaxo Pulse, it's this way that you can hook in the feeds of content that you're producing on lots of different sites and choose to share them with friends or family or business and share different things with different people. And so you get, when I want to stay in touch with somebody, I can see that they posted a photo, and I don't care which service they used, or they posted a link, and I can click back through and read their Yelp restaurant review, and it's a sort of very engaging way of staying in touch with people. But it's hard to get users to fill out all the sites that they use. And if they've already done it by linking in a public way, now you can actually do it in a much more user-friendly way. And like the OpenID thing I showed you, this is a good user experience, and it's also good for Plaxo because it reduces friction and gets more users engaged and sharing more rich content. And so, yeah, this is an example of what Pulse looks like as a result, where you can see there's all this content, and people are leaving comments and sharing things, but it's coming from YouTube and Flickr and blogs and all this sort of content because we're weaving together the stuff that they're already doing elsewhere. And in this day and age, it's not just a Silicon Valley phenomenon. The number of people who are producing some kind of online content somewhere is large and growing larger every day, right? So you can no longer, it's silly to pretend like that's not happening if you're a business when you could be leveraging that to drive engagement and make your users happier. And then the question is then, do I have to be a HTML hacker to participate in this? And the answer is no, because lots of sites let you put these me links in your page for you. So this is my Plaxo public profile page that any user can set up, and you can choose what you want. So I've elected to put on my sort of public work contact info. And on the left, you can see there's this on the web section. And I chose a subset of the sites that I use to link out. Now, I didn't put all my personal sites on there, right? I don't necessarily want everyone who just knows me from hearing a talk to know about all of my personal activities, mainly because of signal and noise more than privacy, honestly, right? It's just sort of not the context of our relationship. But for all the ones that I am comfortable sharing, you can then follow those and start to pull out the information. And so if somebody comes and uses Plaxo or any of these other sites, Pounce does it, LinkedIn does it, et cetera, they can start for the first time to just type in, here are some of the other web pages I use. But that can get put back out in this microformat that gets picked up, and it enriches the sort of social web ecosystem. So as you go and start to invest, that pays off down the line. And you don't even have to use any service to do this yourself. So for example, this is David Recordin, who's one of the main guys who worked on OpenID. He's got his own personal blog, and he's using a plugin from Movable Type called Action Streams, where he's just on his own blog, you tell it which sites you use, and you can see it's got this Find Me Elsewhere section. It's exactly the same thing. It's a bunch of me links of his other profiles, and it also enriches his blog. So when you go see his personal blog, it's not just articles he's published himself. It's also this activity he's done on these other sites. And that's all marked up the same way. And the great thing about open standards is it doesn't matter if it's you're doing it on your own blog or if you're using a site like Plaxo or Pounce or LinkedIn or any of these other ones. Everybody can do it, and all the data flows in the same way. And so you can start to, over time, build a richer and richer profile of information. And that's very powerful. Okay. So those are sort of the big players going on right now in the identity space, and that's definitely something that you want to be thinking about. Now, of course, this is the social track, so it wouldn't be very interesting just to be able to build a rich personal profile if I couldn't start to then use that to share with my friends. And when I talk about who I know, what I mean is, how do you start to actually build and enrich the sort of real relationships you want to have with people? Because again, just like I'm a real person, I'm not having to re-represent myself as a user ID and password on every single system. I have real relationships out in the real world, right? And I think the people at Facebook say this very eloquently, where they say, we're modeling the true social graph that is extant in the real world, right? It's not our social graph per se. It's we have been able to cobble together some of those relationships in digital form, but lots of sites are doing that, right? There's lots of sites where I'm doing some kind of social interaction, and right now it's all completely fragmented. So I, as a user, am benefited by having a richer, more accurate copy of who I know, and not just who I know, but what's the nature of those relationships. Who are my friends? Who are my family? Who are my strong ties? Who are my weak ties? And so it behooves everyone in this social space to find a way to get more and more of that data represented digitally so that we can start to do cool things with it. So one good piece of news that's happened in recent weeks and months, this whole space is moving so quickly, is the way people used to do this until quite recently, right, is they say, well, we're desperate for any source of data about who you know, because starting from scratch is so hard, right? It's one thing for me to fill in my, name and telephone number, I kind of know that, but to tell you about the hundreds of people I know just to see who's on a site is very hard. So they said, well, a lot of people use webmail, so let's go ask for your Gmail or Yahoo Mail or Hotmail credentials and scrape down the data from your address book on webmail, because, at least that's something, right? And I think everybody always knew that that's kind of hacky and kind of insecure and kind of undesirable for a lot of reasons, but it was compared to nothing, it was actually a really good way of getting bootstrapped. But luckily, the sites that have that data have realized that rather than fighting this, it's actually good to sort of help do it the right way. And so almost all of those major sites, and more coming, are adding real contact APIs where, without giving away your password and without having to do screen scraping, you can say, okay, hey, I'm a Google user. Let me go say, yes, I trust this site to find out who's in my address book, and you can start to mash that up. And of course, the thing that's interesting there is not only does it make it easier on the new site, it actually makes it more valuable for me as a user to maintain a good Gmail address book or wherever it is I'm keeping my information, because I know I can now use it in lots of different places. And so it's actually valuable to have that information in there when it becomes part of an ecosystem. Right? It's not, when I go to a site that wants to know who I know on Gmail, it's not a webmail site. It's not competing like Google's. I'm not pulling my data out to abandon Gmail. I'm making the tools in my life work better together so that I use them all more. And that's actually a really important takeaway, because sometimes when people talk about data portability and all this, they think it's about making it easy to just leave one place and go another place. But the much bigger opportunity is making all the tools you use play together so that the pie itself grows tremendously. And of course, the interesting thing there is that a lot of that data about who you know is quite private. Certainly, Plaxo users' address books are very private and personal to them. You can't just have that out on the web, even though for profile information, at least for some of it, people are happy to put that out publicly. Most people don't want to have their address book be public. And so you need a way of letting users say, hey, it's okay if this site that I trust has access to this private info. Another really important lesson is you don't have to make data public to make it portable, right? Portable just means that you have a way of securely exchanging it between trusted parties with the user in control. And so OAuth is a good standard way of doing that. Lots of sites, in each of these cases, you'll see examples where sites sort of built for themselves a bunch of versions because they'd all kind of come up with the same sort of answer. So, if you go to Google, they use AuthSub, right, which is this thing where you bounce over, you sign in, you come back, you get a token. Yahoo has BBAuth. Same user flow, but different code, and it's hard for developers to write and debug all that crypto, especially for a bunch of different sites, right? Facebook has Facebook Auth. Flickr has Flickr Auth, right, which is different than BBAuth, even though Yahoo owns Flickr. It's totally fragmented. And so what the OAuth guys did, this was another one of these great examples of an effort where it was grassroots community people working with larger and smaller companies and saying, hey, no one's winning here when there's 100 different delegated authentication mechanisms, right? You're all basically doing the same thing anyway. Let's come up with a good sort of standard recipe that you can all adopt. We can build libraries in all the popular languages. We can teach people how to do it. And everyone's going to be able to use all this stuff a lot more. And that's what OAuth is. And so it was finalized late last year, and you've seen great support from a lot of the big players, and you're starting to see it roll out on big sites. And you certainly hear Yahoo and Google and Microsoft, and even not Microsoft yet, but a lot of these people in their talks, you saw it in Dave Glazer's talk yesterday, say OAuth is one of those pieces in his Friend Connect circle. So it's one of those things that's very quickly going from being just something that people are sort of talking about to something that I think you'll start to see very soon. And for good reason, because it solves the problem well, elegantly, and it moves the ball forward. And then, of course, what you want to do beyond that is get away from this sort of model of just a one-time import of the data that really doesn't reflect the fact that I'm making and changing these relationships all the time. You want to start actually making that information flow in a persistent way so that as, for example, any new startup, you go in and you're like, oh, this is sort of a cool new site, Doppler, or find my friends that are sharing trips or whatever, right? Well, I go in and say I pull in my Gmail address book and I find friends, and I find a few friends. Okay, but now 3 months go by, 6 months go by. If it's a hot site, a ton more people are going to be joining that site, right? And I'm not hearing about that. That's bad for me. It's bad for Doppler. So you want to start actually making this stuff flow in real time. Or I'm meeting new people. I'm going to meet a bunch of new people at Google I/O, right? Which sites are you using that I'm using? That nothing is actively trying to figure that out. And so that's the direction I think this who you know stuff is really going to go. And again, user in control. This is not about having all the same friends on all the sites. It's about letting you decide where you want that information to flow and not. But in the cases that you do, there's so much fragmentation that I think today is really where most of the pain lies. It's places where you and I have a perfectly reasonable relationship, and like, I had no idea you were using the site that I did. If I did, we would share information, but we just don't know because nothing's trying to help us. And that is the real opportunity for us all to do better. You're starting to see some cool examples of that. So here's, when you go, Flickr has this friend finder to see which your friends are sharing photos. They've actually used all of the APIs from Yahoo and Google and Microsoft that don't take passwords. So you can say, hey, I use Gmail, and it says go authorize, and you log into Gmail and come back, and then it can just quickly show you the friends of yours that use Flickr, right? That's a pretty cool way of like doing it right, at least to the extent that they had to implement it for different sites different ways, but the user experience comes out pretty good in the end. And Doppler posted this screenshot. I don't know if they've shipped this yet or not, but they actually was sort of an idea where they would sort of periodically recheck the information that you gave to see which of them are already using Doppler and suggest new people you want to connect to. So we're starting to see good motion in this direction, and it's pretty clear there's a lot of value if we keep going there. Okay. We're actually doing pretty good on time, so that's good. Hopefully I'm not going so fast that it's totally overwhelming, but that's what Q&A is for. So you now hopefully have a good sense of OpenID and OAuth and Social Graph API and how that sort of lets me paint a richer picture of who I am and helps me do a better job of finding my friends on these various sites. But then, of course, what's really useful about that is what are we all doing? How do we actually stay in touch with each other? That's really the lifeblood of the social web is this activity. And really, it's about staying up to date with people that you care about, right? The whole point is that there's lots of different activities we all engage in. We all have different hobbies and different passions. We all live in different parts of the world. And so, for any given subset of activity, there are going to be people who are really passionate about it and can build some really great way for people who are really into cooking or for people who are really into scuba diving, right? They're going to do some really great job of building something that allows people who care about that stuff to stay richly in touch. But that doesn't work where each one of those has to try to build up a whole big social network from scratch, right? It only works. That's only going to work. That flowering is only going to happen when these things can all talk to each other. And a funny case that I've been thinking about lately is, I, like probably most of you, read Dig to see, what stories are interesting. And Dig has a way where you can be connected to friends and see what stories they're digging. And it's actually kind of cool if you do it because, rather than just seeing what the sort of unwashed masses thinks are interesting, it's actually people you really respect, and it becomes this way of sort of sharing articles. But I actually have a terrible friends list on Dig. I have like 3 friends. Even though I know almost everyone I uses Dig, and I know that I'm in Silicon Valley working at, with Web 2.0 startups, and if I'm not connected there, right, it's just because it's never been worth my trouble to go and hook it up, and I don't know how good their friend finder is, and it would be stale. But I'm missing all this activity of people I know saying, hey, I think this is an interesting story, right? That's bad for me. It's bad for them. It's bad for Dig. And Dig is a really popular site. What is some little site supposed to do if Dig can't even get that momentum going because it's just too fragmented? Right? So, that's something to think about. This is not just for the little guys. This is for everybody. So OpenSocial is clearly a big piece of this game because, once you have a world where there's all these sites talking about people and friends and activity, you need a common language for them to be able to all talk to each other. And so OpenSocial does a couple of different things, and I think it's been a little bit misunderstood. Certainly, one of the things that it does is provide a common language for people who want to build social applications to live inside existing social networks and not have to rewrite their app over and over again. And that's really useful and that's really good. But more fundamentally, it establishes a sort of common language for talking about people and friends and activity that all these sites now speak and all these applications now speak. So I think it's going to build a lot of those pieces that allow those sites to talk to each other and those applications to talk to each other and for that information to flow across the web in more interesting ways. And you're starting to see things like that in Friend Connect, right, which is built on top of OpenSocial, but allows sites to start saying, oh, rather than it being inside an existing social network, it's inside this guy found a guacamole site and rated a guacamole recipe really cool, and that can flow back and you can find your friends, right? So it starts to really open up the notion of what that information means when you have a standard language you can all talk about. And so here's some, Plaxo was actually the first site to ever be an OpenSocial container live, and we're eager to keep with the project and keep shipping, the versions keep revving as they keep building more and more features. But already it was on day one, on the left side here, this is a cutaway of my profile box, and I could put in the songs I like module, and I could put in the fun wall from slide. And for those of you who aren't used to all the social networking stuff, these are some of the most popular apps that have been on MySpace and Facebook that have sort of won the Darwinian battle for stuff that users really like. And, Plaxo is a pretty big site, but it's not as big as those guys, and we didn't have a big developer program. And if we had to build our own completely proprietary language and platform and get all of these sites to, woo their developers to build a Plaxo-specific version, forget about it. It would have taken forever, right? But because we were able to use a standard and they were able to use a standard, we had all of that great stuff working on Plaxo in day one. And that's a big win for us. It's a win for these guys because they probably would have liked to get the distribution on Plaxo. It just wasn't worth a ton of work. It was worth this much work, right? And even cooler, then the activity that gets generated from OpenSocial applications can show up in your Pulse stream like it came from another website. So over here, this big smiley face is that John used this emote app from RockU, and it's a nice, funny way to sort of say how your mood is. And that shows up in Pulse, and people are commenting on it. And you see it's right next to this John posting something on Twitter, and it looks exactly the same to users. The only difference is one's a standalone website, and one's an OpenSocial gadget. But they're really both socially enabled applications, and it blurs the line when you have a common language. And this is kind of the proof in the pudding that users shouldn't even have to care what type of application it really is. So I think that's actually something very powerful. So that's OpenSocial. And obviously, plenty more talks if you want to dive more into OpenSocial around Google I/O. There's a lot of really good content here. I bring up RSS and Atom. It's almost sort of silly because it's been around much longer, but I still think a lot of people have this intuition that that's only about blogs or personal websites or whatever. And really, RSS and Atom is a much more general framework for if you have activity that is time-based and you want to syndicate that between different sites, it's a very good way of doing it. It's basically here's a time-sequenced list of events with some information about them. And so all of the stuff that we do on Pulse, okay, well, I'll show you a thing in a second, but any activity that you're creating, any social activity, I made a restaurant review on Yelp, I did a tweet, I did an emote, that can all be represented as RSS and Atom, and it absolutely should be. If you're a site that's helping users create behavior and express themselves, that's only going to be useful to you and to them if the people they care about actually see it, right? So by making it something that they can syndicate and sharing it around the web, then all of a sudden you're going to get a lot more attention and a lot more engagement, and users are going to be a lot more likely to want to express themselves in the first place because they have a good chance everybody will see it. Yelp is a great example that we've seen in Plaxo Pulse, where Yelp is this restaurant review site, and most people just read reviews, they don't write reviews. And I think part of the reason is the motivation to write a review just to sort of, be for the sort of unwashed internet audience is far less compelling than if I know, I went to this cool restaurant last night, I really want my friends to know about it, and I want them to know my take on it. All of a sudden, if I know my friends are going to see it, that's incredibly compelling. And so we've seen all these people start to use Yelp because of Pulse, just to share reviews, because all of a sudden it's sort of a fun, cool way to express yourself. And then lots of other people see those reviews who would never have even known about Yelp, let alone seen their friend's review, and they see it, and they see the logo, and they click through, and they start using Yelp, and it's this great virtuous cycle where people find out the applications and use them more and are more motivated to express themselves because the information is set free. So it's another one of those things I hope you can keep an example of how sometimes it's easy intuitively to think, if I open up, that means I lose my advantage. But it's quite the opposite. It's like saying, authors have much more to fear from obscurity than piracy, right? I think that's true for almost all of us, that you want your users to be able to communicate with each other, and you want to let them do that as well as possible. This is a very simple and powerful way to do that. And then XMPP is something some of you may or may not have heard of. It started out as a kind of an open standard for doing instant messaging. So, Yahoo Instant Messenger and AOL Instant Messenger, they would all talk to each other, and XMPP was a sort of general way of doing it. But it's actually, there's a bunch of really useful general purpose utilities in there for sort of just doing real-time messaging. So the thing with RSS is if everybody is sort of polling everybody else and saying, hey, do you have anything new? Hey, do you have anything new? Hey, do you have anything new? That starts to have scaling problems. So with XMPP, you actually just sort of start listening, hey, I want to know when John tweets, and they'll just tell me. It's like he sent me a message, but it's, he sent me a tweet. And so I think that's something that you're going to hear more and more about as sort of a way to, when you want to start doing real-time, and messaging too, right? If I want to send you a message, and I'm on Twitter and you're on Pounce, they built this sort of XMPP bridge right? Or at least in demo, I don't know if they shipped it or not, but like that, you could start to actually send messages back and forth because it already knows how to do that federation. So that's another thing you want to sort of start looking at because as more and more of these applications start to scale and share more data, I think you're going to be hearing more about it. And to show an example, this is just a snapshot I took. It's actually out of date by now of a bunch of the services that you can share content from in Plaxo Pulse. Now, we're a pretty small company, and there's just no way we could have done custom integrations with all these sites. But because almost all of them use RSS and Atom feeds, it's very, very easy for us to be able to just say, oh, give us your Jaiku username, and we'll start to pull in all your Jaiku messages, and you can choose to share them with people. So if you're, any site should be caring about these open standards so that you're not making people have to build custom for you because that's always just a higher barrier to get people to do stuff. But if you're a small site, it's doubly important because there's just a bunch of these sites, that we just could not have justified with our resource constraints to have gone and worked with them, except for the fact that they basically got in for free because they were using open standards, right? And that's the same argument behind OAuth and these other things. It's like if you make people do some custom thing for you, you're basically just making it harder for them to do what you want them to do. And so if you can find open standards, if you can find existing technologies, and you can say, hey, there's already libraries for that, or you already know how to do that, or if you build it for us, you'll be able to work with a bunch of other people too. It's just a much more, pragmatic way of getting people to actually integrate with you. And that's the lifeblood of any social application. And that's why you get this sort of rich feed again, right, to sort of show you that slide again. It's because this stuff can actually just flow. So I hope you sort of heard a theme in all of those things, which is, when the tools work together better, users use them more, they like them more, and the sites get more traffic and they get more engaged. And that's a really powerful, sort of pattern that affects lots of more things. And there's even more technologies I haven't even mentioned up here, right? There's one of my favorite new ones is a thing called Embed, where if you're sharing links between stuff, it's a sort of open standard where you can go out and get a thumbnail graphic or get a sort of media embed. And so it makes it much easier to sort of share rich things between sites. And there's a new one popping up every day, right? Because it's getting easier and easier to build these, and people are starting to get the message that this sort of stuff is powerful and important. But I think it leaves a lot of, once people get excited about this stuff, and okay, I got to learn about it, oh man, I got to have to program all this stuff, they start to get a little bit confused about, am I going to have to do all of this myself? Like, what is this sort of architecture going to look like? How's this all going to space out? So I wanted to sort of bring this all together by stepping back and thinking a little about how I see the kind of social web ecosystem evolving. And at the end, a sort of a specific point to you guys to think about. There's going to be sort of different answers depending on how big you are and what your focus is, and trying to figure out where you fit in. And that's going to really help you determine where you need to focus on first. So you've got a user, and they're out on the web, right? And you've got this whole set of social websites that are all doing some little different thing. And I think the question really boils down to, how does the user interact with each of these different sites? Does each site have to build this stuff up from scratch? Are they all going to have to do some thing where they all talk to each other? How is that all going to work? And I think what we're seeing evolve, which I think is the right thing both from a sort of user experience perspective but also from a technical perspective, is you're going to have room in the middle for a new sort of service layer of providers that help users intermediate between all the different sites that they use in a way that is good on both sides. So you're going to have a class of identity providers, right, which is saying, I'm going to choose one or more sites to say, you know what, I've already got an account with you, I've already got a password, I've already filled out data. When I go to some new site, the site's just going to say, oh, hey, do you already have an identity provider? Great, I'll take that, right? It's kind of like, oh, you already use Visa? Yeah, I'm not going to make you sign for a separate card, right? And that's something we're already seeing, right? Clearly, the reason Yahoo, or at least one of the reasons Yahoo likes being an OpenID provider is it says, oh, well, if I'm a Yahoo user and I can use that all over the web, that makes it more valuable for me to be a Yahoo user, right? That makes me more loyal and more engaged. And a lot of other sites are seeing the same thing. And it doesn't mean that small sites can't be OpenID providers too, right? So I think because they each have their own thing, if I go to a site and I say, hey, I can tell you that I'm part of this particular association or hobby group or whatever, that could be a useful thing, right? It's like having a specialty card, Banana Republic card or whatever it is, right? So I think you're going to see a whole bunch of different people be identity providers. And you can consume from lots of different identity providers. That's totally fine. But the point is, that'll be a standard layer that the next generation of sites will almost take for granted, as of course you're already going to have an identity provider and you can use it. You already see, there's a bookmarking site that's very cool called Magnolia. And they now only accept OpenID logins. Because they're like, that's not core to us to manage accounts and worry about lost passwords. I mean, that's a big pain. And with Yahoo and AOL and all these others having OpenIDs, it's no longer unreasonable to expect that users would be able to do an OpenID. And they're obviously forward thinking there, but I think that's going to become more and more common. And then content aggregators is another category that I think Plaxo Pulse was kind of a pioneer there, and you've seen friend feed since then, and now it seems like another one each week. And some people wonder, is this just a fad? And I think it's fundamentally not a fad, and it's actually a very important layer of this ecosystem, because in a world where there's going to be so many different sites and a new one every week doing some little bit of content, it's just not going to be feasible to go around to every single website and just check if there's anything new. So having aggregators where you can start to say, here's what I want to share with a bunch of people, and sharing different things with different people, and then using that as a discovery engine and going back to the original sites is going to be an incredibly important thing to drive traffic to those sites and to find things. And like, I don't know about you, but some people I know, tweet 10 times a day, and it's hard to keep up with them. And some of the people that I think are most useful on Twitter maybe do it once a month, right? And I can't be expected to go to a site every day and check if my friend, maybe today's that once a month day, right? That obviously doesn't scale. But if it just shows up in my aggregator, it's like, oh, cool. You check it out. All of a sudden, that actually makes that more powerful than someone who's doing it all the time. And then there's the last piece in the middle, which is something that I don't think people have talked about as much lately, but I think it's going to be just as important as these other layers. And it's certainly something that Plaxo is going to be spending a lot of time on. And it's something you started to see a good glimmer of with Friend Connect, and that is being a social graph provider. So that's that who you know layer, right? So the color scheme here is not an accident. This is who I am, who I know, and what's going on. And that's going to be the service layer of the social web. So social graph providers are going to be places that say, hey, I've already built up a rich information about who you know. I'm going to let you take that with you around the web so that when you go to a new site, you can say, hey, I've already got a bunch of friends here. Let me see who I know in this context, right? And that's been something that I think these other two, identity providers and content aggregators, have been pretty straightforward. There's going to be some time to adopt. And the social graph provider one is, I think there's been a lot more kind of confusion and contention about, is that something that needs to be trapped in a walled garden? Is that the value of a social network, is the social graph? Or is it just like these other things where when you empower your users to work together with the tools they use, everybody does better? And ultimately the market will decide, but we're certainly in the camp that believes that helping your users stay connected to other people all around the web is a very valuable thing, both for them and for us. And I think a lot of people agree. So I wanted to sort of paint what I think of as what will be a day in the life of this new social web. And again, we're already seeing glimmers of that today, but I think this is going to become routine. You're going to have somebody like my friend John who's going and he checks out some new site. And it's some little site that no one's ever heard of. It's for beer aficionados or something. It's like, oh, he wants to say, oh, yeah, I found this new Oregon craft brew that's really just awesome. And that's a perfectly good niche that people care about. But it's the kind of activity where if he can't just go in and start playing around because of his identity provider, there's a very high bar for him to actually even check that thing out. It's like, oh, great, another look in my spam folder to see if they round-tripped my email, right? But he can just go with his OpenID provider or whatever. It doesn't have to be OpenID, just identity provider technology, and say, oh, okay, let me start playing around and checking this stuff out. And then he'll use his social graph provider, and he'll say, oh, you know what? Of your 300 people you're connected to, there's a couple other people that are also into craft brews. And you're like, wow, I never knew that, right? Because there's a lot of things I don't know about people. And this is, of course, assuming that they said, I'm comfortable being found on this site, right? That's all in user control. So for people who said, hey, if somebody else I know is also into craft brews, let's hook up, right? And he can easily start to find them, and they can start to share and start to create content. And that's just, again, this really nice relationship where going through a friend finder and worrying about, are they going to spam all my friends and all, it's like, no. You find people, you start sharing, it's great. And because then John's using an aggregator, that some of that content comes back out. And so maybe that's in Pulse or FriendFeed or anything else, or Facebook. And I say, oh, John posted this activity about, oh, there's this new beer that I'm totally into. And what's cool is, not only does that help me stay in touch with John, because it's like, oh, it starts a discussion, it actually introduces me to that beer site in the first place. I never would have heard about it before. But because this information's flowing, and because it was able to flow on the site and off the site, I'm now excited. I go over and I start to check out the site, and I go use my OpenID provider to log in. I start looking at beers, and the whole cycle repeats itself. And what's magical about this is all of a sudden, I think it gets you back to what made the web explode in the first place, which was in the days of the web when you had open standards where anybody could throw up a web server and program some code, and two guys in a garage could build the next big thing. You just had this incredible flowering of innovation and a virtuous cycle. And the reason that hasn't happened yet on the social web is because it's no longer enough just to have the protocols. You also need to have the data, right? You need to know who these people are and who they know and what they're doing. And so I couldn't just go off and start another website and expect that it would take off, because that data can't come with it. But users want to be able to have that happen. And there's so many great social experiences wait to be built. And this, I think, actually now for the first time, we have enough of the building blocks in place where we can actually make that back to a reality of any two guys can come up with the next great thing. And this is going to be very exciting. So people ask, is the social web played out? I think we're just getting started. I think we're on the cusp of the next major phase of the web, and I don't think that's an understatement. It's a very exciting time. Oh, what did I just do? Okay, one thing I wanted to say is a lot of people may think that's a lot of work, and I'm not sure I can really go through building OpenID and even taking all these service layers. And so Google did this thing called Friend Connect, which said, hey, they see exactly the same ecosystem. When you talk to them, it's like we go over and talk to them. They're like, hey, did you write that slide or did we? I think they're very strategically aligned in this sort of thinking. And what they realized was there's a whole class of websites out there that aren't even social at all because it's too hard, but they actually would benefit from being social. So it's some guy's cooking website or a local band or whatever, where it's like you would like to not just be an anonymous user of that site. You'd like to be able to log in and talk to people and share your opinions, but it's just a lot of work. And so they said there's all these technologies already out there, OpenID, OAuth. That's the right answer. We're not going to reinvent that, but let's let that long tail get started by giving them a widget they can drop in that speaks all of those languages. So that's what Friend Connect is. It doesn't do anything new except give you an out-of-box drop-in experience that lets you play in this social web ecosystem. And so I think a lot of sites are going to use Friend Connect to get started and start playing in the social web. And then as you grow, you may decide that you want to make a more custom integrated experience that's sort of natural in that escalation curve. And so you may decide to swap out parts or all of Friend Connect and start doing the technology yourself. But you don't have to start over. It's all the same technology. It's all the same building blocks. And fundamentally, it's that same social web ecosystem model where you're expecting people to come to you who already have accounts and profiles and friends and activity, and you're expecting the data on your site to flow back out to other sites. So I think that's going to be a real turbocharger to getting this started. So if you're a very small site and you think, God, I'd love to play in this world, but I don't know if I can build that stuff for myself, then Friend Connect's probably for you. And if you're someone that wants to be bigger and more ambitious and build more yourself, then it's exactly the same set of technologies. You just use libraries and things like that to do it yourself. So I hope that clears up where that sort of fits in, because it's actually a surprisingly good answer. When a new piece comes out and it just fits in, each one that does that, I think, is a proof point that we're kind of on the right track here. So that was sort of what I wanted to take you through, but there's one little wrinkle. I think I kind of hand-waved and did a little sleight of hand on one piece, which is I said you're going to go to this site, it's going to find out who your friends are, and you're going to get connected up, right? And if you actually stop for a minute and think about how does that actually mechanically work at a detailed level, in a generic way? What does that even mean? What are my friends on this site? How do I know this is the same guy, right? Well, okay, first of all, I have to tell a site what my social graph provider is, right? In the case of my OpenID provider, that's pretty easy because I log in with my Yahoo ID or I type in my URL. But in a social graph provider right now, it's like, well, how do you say who that is? And then they have to pull in your data and find who your friends are, right? How do they do that? How do they access the data? It's private. What is the format? And then they have to do that and match it up on their website and actually find people. Well, in this first category, right now, the answer is you list a Google logo and a Yahoo logo and a Microsoft logo, and you sort of say pick one, right? And so that obviously doesn't scale very well. But there's actually a pretty good answer there. It's something called XRDS Simple that works with OAuth. It's part of OpenID. It used to be called Yadis, if you've heard of that. But basically, it's a very, very simple thing. We're given a URL. I can point you to a little document that just has more URLs of more services about me. So that's how OpenID works. And you type in josephsmarr.com, it goes and finds the XRDS document for that site. And it's just a very simple little XML document that says, oh, I have a service of type OpenID provider that's at the following URL. And I have a service of type whatever. It's extensible. So you can say, here's my bookmarking service, or here's my photo service, or here's my whatever service. And then with OAuth, that's a sort of standard way of getting at that private data, right? So a lot of these sites are still rolling out OAuth support, but at least there to be able to say, here's where I keep my contacts, and I give you permission to go and get it. There's a pretty good story there. And the bottom one's pretty straightforward, right? You get the list of identifiers. It could be email addresses like most people do today. It could be URLs of here's my other profile. And they just look those up against who's on the site. And when you've got a actual persistent access through OAuth, you can do that kind of friends list portability stuff of looking over time, going out to the social graph API, expanding that range of identifiers. There's a pretty good story there. So what about the middle? That's actually something where right now there is no good standard. There is no agreed upon way of sharing address book and friends list information between sites. There's vCard, which is kind of just a way of saying here's some old contact information, but it's not an API, and it doesn't sort of reflect the more modern aspects of social networking. Some of OpenSocial is moving in that direction, but there's lots of other sites that have each implemented their own thing. And back to that Flickr example, what's going on behind the scenes here, even though it looks pretty good for users, is Flickr built separate authentication and separate contacts access and separate schema mapping and all of that for every single one of these sites. And so, that was already a fair amount of work, but you can already convince yourself that it's not going to scale. And particularly, it's not just going to be the big internet players up there. In a world where I'm doing social things on all these different sites, every one of them has some of my social graph information that I'm going to want to be able to aggregate and flow. So this has to scale to hundreds of thousands of sites. You absolutely are going to need some sort of standard where you're not rebuilding everything from scratch. And even in Google Friend Connect, again, sort of very nice UI that kind of sweeps it under the rug of saying, oh, just hook in your Facebook friends or hook in your Orchid friends. I guess not Facebook friends anymore. But conceptually, right, same thing. But again, they had to build completely separate implementations for each one of these. So they were using the Facebook API for Facebook, and they were using something for Orchid and something different for Gtalk, and right. So that also doesn't scale. And the fact that in both cases the UI looks so uniform and so great tells you like that is the right model. There just needs to be the standards getting pushed down the chain in order to make that really a reality. So what I want to let you know is there's actually something that's sort of gotten started there. And it's early days, so I don't want to draw too much attention to it. But I just want you to know that this is something a lot of people in the grassroots community have been talking about, big companies have been talking about. And we've started to put together sort of what would a good standard look like that's simple, that allows people to exchange information securely, that builds on these existing standards, that works well with the existing players and also small players. And we've got a little bit of information up at portablecontext.net, but it's really just getting started. But it's important, if you want to get involved, come check it out, come talk to me. And at least know that that is something people are working on, because a lot of people have independently agreed that, yeah, that is the problem we all need to work on next. And I'm very confident that there's going to be a lot of momentum there very quickly, just because it is the thing that is going to glue these all together. And when you have that piece, you actually, for the first time, have a very good end-to-end scenario for, we started with this thing of people are asking for your email and password and scraping your information down, right? And we now, with each of these pieces, have a great answer of how to do that the right way. So I just wanted to close by sort of walking through a concrete example of what that would look like in this world. Because now I think it's actually pretty cool that for the first time, literally ever since I've been working in this space, I can give you a good technically founded answer that goes from A to Z. So I'm going to come to a new site, and I'm going to sign in with my OpenID. Maybe it's a Plaxo OpenID, maybe it's a different OpenID. And the user's going to say, oh, OK, let me go pull up the XRDS for that OpenID URL, and oh, OK, let me see what APIs are available there. And they'll say, oh, you know what? In addition to knowing that you have an account there, I can now see, oh, look, you've got one of those contacts API things that you support. Maybe it's from the same service provider, or maybe I've linked over to my address book somewhere else, but it's a standard API. And so I'll say, OK, let me try to pull your friends in from there. And the site will say, whoa, that's protected. You need access, baby. That's private data. And the way it works is they give an HTTP 401 response, and there's a www authenticate header that says, I'm protected by OAuth. And so you're like, oh, OK, OAuth, that's cool. And so there's this thing called OAuth discovery. It's a standard way, again, using the same XRDS simple stuff. They can look up and they can say, oh, where would I go on this site to get an OAuth token? And where would I go to log in? So they'll pull that information down, and they'll send the user off to do OAuth. And so the user goes and logs in and says, hey, do I trust the site? Yes. Or in the case where it's the same provider as their OpenID, you can actually combine the two. So they just log over and say, hey, do you want to log in and do you trust them to access your information? And you just sort of hand them a token at that point. And now all of a sudden, the user can get access to that data because they've got it. They know who the user is. They know where they keep their contacts. They know how to read that contacts. And they know how to get access to the private data. And this could be a site they've never heard of before and never written a custom line of code for in their life. That's actually a pretty big goal. And we've actually figured it out. And now it's just a matter of getting it deployed and getting people on board. And that's a pretty exciting place to be at right now. So just to conclude, and it looks like we'll still have about 10 minutes for questions, so that's great. I started out by saying, I want you to be able to walk away from this talk with a good sense in your head of how all these building blocks fit together. Which are the, how do I figure out what I'm going to do on my site? What do I need to do custom? What can I assume is going to be done for me? And hopefully now you have a pretty good answer, that the stuff falls into letting users establish their existing identity, letting them find the people they know, and letting them share the activity around. And really what it comes down to in terms of what am I going to go off and start building, it's going to depend a little bit on where you are in this curve. And so this is also to answer the question of where does that social web ecosystem play out? Is everybody going to move towards a couple of big portals? Is it going to become completely fragmented? And I think the answer is it's going to be like the web itself. There's going to be this power law distribution where you have a few very, very large sites, like you have a few very large portals, where there's a lot of activity, but that's not the whole social web. In fact, there's going to be a vast number of sites that are outside of that, and there's going to be a thriving ecosystem where they can all sort of survive, and in fact, in a very symbiotic way. And in the long tail, these are the sites that really Friend Connect addresses, where you may not be having the resources to build this stuff yourself, but you can drop in a widget that starts to get you some of that experience, and it's good enough, considering the alternative, that you wouldn't be able to have it at all. And my guess is most of you are in this body section, or at least you aspire to be in this body section, where you say, I'm not trying to build the next MySpace, but I actually think I could build a nice, thriving community of users. I think I've got a neat twist on it, or I've got a vertical, or I'm going to do something, a different experience. And that is exactly where these technologies are going to be most helpful, because you're not going to be big enough to force everybody to come to you and build custom stuff for you. But you are going to be big enough that you can actually build and thrive a great service if you can rely on those open standards. So if you can use open standards to produce the content so that when people do share information, they can go around the web and tell everybody that they use your site and that they think it's cool and here's what I'm doing. And when people come back and want to check out that site, there's this very nice way of signing up and starting to get experience. You can immediately get engaged, right? When all that flows, those are going to be the biggest winners, and I think that's you. And so I certainly am very excited. I think there's going to be so many more applications that can now be built, and I really do feel like we're at the cusp. We're over the top, and this is where things get really good. So thank you very much. So if you leave if you want to leave, and if you want to ask questions, please use the mic so that they can record that. There's mics there, and maybe that's the only one. We get the question mics up? Okay, go ahead.
Web standards, integration with semantic web standards. Are you guys looking at that kind of process?
Yeah. So the question is, what about the semantic web? So in a way, this is doing the same work as the semantic web, right? It's adding structure to this information so it can allow it to flow. And in certain specific cases, there's a more compelling answer, like the social graph API parses FOAF documents, which are in RDF, and so that's actually a very direct example. Microformats are kind of like semantic web light in that they're encoding real markup, but they're doing it within HTML. But I absolutely see this as moving towards that role of more structure, more user empowerment, and you're going to start to see other agents living on top of that, and there's going to be good stuff that happens. So I'd say yes, but not in the sort of technical way that you might have thought, but yes, absolutely in terms of the vision and the progress.
Excellent. One last thing. I was wondering, has there been any thought put toward getting third-party authority? Imagine, for example, I went to I wanted to look at the comments of climatologists, but not everybody else about a topic. And therefore, maybe I could even have a browser plugin that would filter data so that when I went to a site that is enabled, I could filter out comments based upon not my friends, but the authorities of other websites.
That's a really great question. The question is, I guess you guys can all hear because it's mic'd, right? That's one of the great hopes I have for things like OpenID is that they'll allow you to actually establish real reputation and accreditation that you'll be able to use for filtering. So one example I think is really cool is Sun Microsystems gave all their employees OpenIDs that are at sun.com. And the only way you can get a sun.com OpenID is to be a Sun employee. So if you go to some e-commerce site and they want to give a Sun employee discount, just by logging in with your sun.com email address or your OpenID, they can realize that you really are a Sun employee and they can give you that discount. And the same thing could be true, right? If you work for the NAACP or any of those organizations, they could give you OpenIDs that you can only get if you've got a certain credential there. Or other sites could give you accreditation. You could actually ask them, is this OpenID accredited? And because that's a real portable, durable identifier that you can own, it's actually meaningful to say, yes, this guy with this URL, I assert that he is in good standing. And you can start to build that sort of nice reputation on top of that. So that's going to be a really nice, I think, thing that you just haven't seen today because there hasn't been that identity layer. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Okay, I have a question about data freshness on the friends list and authentication.
Can you speak into the mic? Sorry.
A question about data freshness for the friends list. And you were mentioning using OAuth as a token to authenticate you're getting the friends list. Would you have to get a new token each time you wanted to check the list to see if there had been an update, or is there some sort of persistence to the token that would let it live for a year or something?
So the way OAuth works is once you make the user go through that flow and say it's okay, you can get a permanent access token that's good until revoked. Now some sites may decide by policy to try to revoke it earlier or make you go again, and you may see some extensions that do that kind of thing, but in general, it's good until revoked. Now that's not to say that you shouldn't also be checking for freshness, and that's not to say that certain sites won't have policies that say you should be checking in every so often, because I think there's very valid cases of like if you unfriended somebody somewhere, you want other sites to say, hey, that guy's no longer a friend, don't give him special privilege. And so I think it's going to be important that we sync this information and we keep it fresh. That's things like Jabber, right? Great example. You could imagine that if sites are hooked up with XMPP, you could actually notify them on the spot and say, hey, Joseph just unfriended this other guy, you better tear it down. And so that's all going to be something you can layer on top of it. But no, you're not going to have to constantly make users sign in. Yeah.
Your examples with OAuth were pretty much binary. You're allowed to look at my private data or not.
Yeah.
Is there more of a fine-grained nuance to that where you could use the token to map into some roles and permissions that you could do different things?
Yeah. So OAuth intentionally kind of differs on the issue of the semantics of the token, but the idea is that the client can ask for a set of permissions. So maybe it's read access or read and write, or maybe it's just your address book or just your photo. And then you basically present that to the user, and then you give a token that's only good for those claims. And so you can start to do that kind of more fine-grained permissioning. And we may see that sort of stuff itself turn into standards, but I think it was important to just get the machinery in place first before we legislated what the different types of tokens were, because that tends to be service provider specific. But yeah, good question. Yeah?
This is also related to OAuth. Is it intended to only specify a mechanism for granting capabilities, or is it also going to define some standard capabilities like fetch me context, fetch me this? And if that's the case, that kind of means we're doomed to keeping up with new services when they provide new capabilities for new kinds of data, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so OAuth just gives you a way of giving private data for something, and it leaves what the something is out. And the XRDS simple is the thing that allows you to say, here's new standards, and let me tell you what they are. But they can all be completely different. Everybody can invent their own. And it's basically literally like type in value, type in URL. And the type itself is a URI. So you can say some other website can invent a standard and people use it or not. And that, of course, you don't have to use all the standards that are available, but it at least provides this way of saying, if you recognize that kind of service, then you can do something with it. And I do expect that we'll see standards emerge, not just for portable contacts, but portable calendar, portable photos, portable bookmarks, all that stuff, where there's enough of a common agreement. And that's how RSS worked, right? It's not that RSS is everything that could ever be done in blogging, but it was a nice enough common subset that everybody could support, that you could start to have this ecosystem form around it. And I think for these other sorts of common data types, you're going to see similar things happen. Yeah.
Is there a way of annotating or weighting a friend edge?
Quite, yeah. How do you weight a friend? Yes. I think it's one of the many limitations of the current social web is there's not a lot of richness around what a friend connection means, right? A lot of these sites are kind of one size fits all, and my best friend has the same representation as me being friends with Captain Morgan, right? And it's like that obviously doesn't work very well. And I think one of the reasons that's the case today is that because you can't really move your data around, it's just not worth putting in the effort to really articulate those relationships either explicitly or implicitly through behavior. But in a world where all this stuff can share and where you're actually doing a lot of behavior that's tied to durable identifiers, you can actually start to build up this much richer notion of who you know and who you interact with, and you can start to do explicit labeling. So, at least in Pulse, you can do friend, family, or business, and that's enough to start doing a lot of segmentation. But it's actually ultimately, I think, going to be a lot richer, and it's a necessary precondition that this data be allowed to flow so that over time, by using lots of different sites with lots of different people, and you having durable identifiers, that information can build up and get richer and richer over time. And if you think about it, that's exactly how the real world works, right? The more you know somebody, the more context you know them in, the deeper and more nuanced your relationship with them becomes, and the more valuable you can use that information to do different things. Yeah?
I'm not sure if you cover this or not, but are there any standards around sort of what happens to the data after you give it out, I mean, in terms of service and all that sort of thing, and what control you have over that if companies are acquired, if companies
right.
misuse your data, that sort of thing?
That's a good answer. I mean, the short answer to that is no. The sort of medium to long answer is there are things like Creative Commons licenses. There was this attempt to do things like P3P where people have sort of tried to do machine-readable terms. Nothing has really sort of taken on, and it's so complex and subtle to really sort of specify. I think there is effort to try to do some of that. There's certainly desire by some of the providers to say, I'll give it to you, but on this following terms, and you have to agree to that. If you look at the XRI and XDI work, there's some stuff in there around the semantics around link contracts that's sort of relevant to that. But I think ultimately one of the big questions is how much of this stuff is going to be established via like technical countermeasures versus how much of it is going to rely on kind of the social contract that exists in the real world, right? When you give me your business card, there's no DRM attached to it, right? There's nothing that says you can put it in Outlook, but you can't put it in Lotus. Or if you export it from Outlook and import it to Gmail, you better ask me permission first, right? Like, there's just none of that machinery. And in fact, it's kind of okay that there's none of that machinery, because what stops me from taking your business card and putting it up on a billboard on 101 is not that I can't, but that it's just not worth it to me, because I'll damage my reputation, you won't like me, other people may not like me. And the same thing is true on the social web. So a lot of people are worried about that. You pull your friends from one place and you want to put them somewhere else, and, oh, it's got to stop it. And it's like, well, maybe there's some reasonable balance to be had there about letting data flow in different ways. But fundamentally what's going to make it work is the right social constraints and the right identity and reputation, where if somebody does bad behavior, there's public consequences for it. And that's actually ultimately a much stronger countermeasure than trying to put DRM around something which fundamentally, as we all know, just doesn't work. Yeah, so I guess I've got 48 seconds left, so if somebody quickly runs up to a mic, they can ask one more question. Otherwise, happy to stick around and talk in the hallway.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you've seen any change in the way OpenID providers, relying parties that are not just free services, where there's some money involved.
Yeah.
If you've seen that coming.
Yeah, I think that area is still progressing, but there are sites like Hadoop that are actually doing real monetization strategies around being a provider and showing targeted advertising and things like that. And I think it's definitely an area that as you start going up higher value transactions, credit cards make money on each transaction because they're performing a service. They're saying, yes, I can vouch that this is a real person who really does have money, and that's worth something. So I think you'll see the same thing in the identity space. So it is still fairly early days. 1 second left. Yes, thank you.